Tonight we are going to talk about Empress Wu Zetian, the Dragon Empress of China. Close your eyes now, and let yourself drift backward through time, through centuries that fold like silk upon silk, through dynasties that rose and fell like the breathing of the earth itself. We are traveling to ancient China, to the Tang Dynasty, when the Middle Kingdom stood at the height of its splendor, when poets composed verses that would echo through the ages, when the Silk Road brought treasures from distant lands, and when the imperial court glittered with a refinement that seemed to touch the heavens themselves. The air grows thick with the scent of sandalwood and jasmine. You can hear, faintly, the whisper of silk robes moving through marble corridors, the soft chime of bells carried on the wind, the distant sound of a guqin being played somewhere in a moonlit garden. This is Tang China, a world of ritual and beauty, of philosophy and poetry, of careful order and breathtaking artistry. In this world of emperors and scholars, of Buddhist temples and Confucian wisdom, one woman would rise to heights no woman had reached before or would reach again. Her name was Wu Zetian, and she would become the only woman in China's 4,000-year history to rule as emperor in her own right, to claim the mandate of heaven, to sit upon the dragon throne and command an empire that stretched from the deserts of the west to the shores of the eastern sea. Let the tensions of your day dissolve now, like morning mist beneath the sun. There is nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to remember. Just the story, unfolding like a scroll painted with scenes of ancient beauty, and your breath, steady and calm, as we begin our journey into the life of the Dragon Empress. In the year 624, during the reign of Emperor Gaozu, founder of the Tang Dynasty, a daughter was born to the Wu family in the province of Shaanxi. The exact circumstances of her birth are wrapped in the gauze of time and legend, but we know she entered a world that was itself being reborn. The Sui dynasty had recently fallen, torn apart by overreach and rebellion, and the Tang had risen from its ashes like the phoenix of legend, bringing with it promises of order, prosperity, and cultural flourishing. The Wu family was not of the highest nobility, but neither were they common. Her father, Wu Shihuo, was a successful timber merchant who had supported the Tang's rise to power and been rewarded with official positions. This placed the family in that interesting space between the old aristocracy and the merchant class, wealthy enough to provide education and opportunities, but without the ancient lineage that would have opened the highest doors of power automatically. The child was given the name Zhao, meaning luminous or shining, though history would come to know her by other names. From her earliest years, she was marked by an unusual quality, an intelligence that seemed to pierce through surfaces to the essence of things, a presence that drew attention even when she said nothing. Her father, perhaps recognizing something exceptional in his daughter, did what few men of his time did. He educated her. Picture the young Wu Zhao in her father's study, surrounded by scrolls and books, learning to read and write the complex characters that were the key to all learning in China. The brush moves across paper, black ink flowing in shapes that carry meaning thousands of years old. She learns not just the characters themselves, but the classics they contain, the analects of Confucius, the poetry of earlier dynasties, the histories of kingdoms that rose and fell before the Tang. Her mind absorbed these lessons, like earth absorbing rain. She learned that power was not just a matter of force, but of legitimacy, of being seen to possess the mandate of heaven that justified rule. She learned that history was written by those who held power, but also that it held them accountable, judging their reigns against the ideals of good governance. She learned the art of poetry, where meaning could be layered beneath beauty, where a verse about falling blossoms might really be about the transience of power or the pain of separation. The house where she grew up was comfortable, filled with the things that marked a successful family in Tang China: carved wooden furniture, silk hangings, porcelain vessels, perhaps a small garden where water trickled over stones and carp swam in shaded pools. The rhythms of daily life followed ancient patterns: the marking of seasons with appropriate festivals, the honoring of ancestors with offerings and prayers, the careful observation of propriety and ritual that held society together like invisible threads. But when Wu Zhao was perhaps 13 or 14 years old, her father died, and with his death, the family's comfortable position became precarious. In Tang China, status and security flowed through male lines, and without Wu Shihuo's protection and income, his widow and daughters faced an uncertain future. The family's wealth had been substantial, but relatives began to circle, questioning the widow's right to manage property, pushing the family toward the margins of respect and influence. These were formative years for the young woman who would become Empress Wu. She watched as her mother struggled to maintain dignity and resources in a system designed to favor men. She experienced firsthand how quickly fortune could change, how vulnerable even educated, capable women were when the structures of power turned against them. These lessons, learned in the bitterness of loss and displacement, would shape her understanding of power and her determination to secure it in ways that couldn't be easily taken away. But fate or fortune, or the inscrutable patterns that govern human lives, was about to present an opportunity that would change everything. In the year 637, when Wu Zhao was approximately 13 years old, word came that Emperor Taizong was selecting young women from official families to join the imperial palace as kairen, the fifth rank of imperial concubines, attendants who served the emperor, but whose primary role was to grace the palace with beauty and accomplishment. For a family in the Wu's position, this was simultaneously an honor and a solution. To have a daughter selected for the imperial palace brought prestige to the family and secured her future in ways that marriage into a declining household could not. The young woman would leave her family behind, would likely never return home, would become part of that mysterious world within the forbidden city's walls, where the emperor moved like the sun around which all things revolved. But she would be safe, provided for, and positioned, however remotely, near the centers of power. Imagine the journey from Shaanxi to Chang'an, the capital city that was then the largest and most cosmopolitan city in the world. The young Wu Zhao traveled by carriage or sedan chair, moving through landscapes that shifted from the loess plateaus of her home province to the fertile plains around the capital. She would have passed through villages and towns, across rivers on ancient bridges, through gates guarded by officials checking travel documents. Chang'an itself must have been overwhelming to someone who had never seen anything like it. The city was laid out in a perfect grid, walls surrounding walls, the forbidden city at its heart, like the center of a cosmic mandala. Wide avenues ran straight as surveyors' lines, lined with merchants' shops and officials' residences, temples and markets, wine shops and tea houses. The population included not just Chinese, but Sogdians and Persians, Indians and Koreans, traders from the far reaches of the Silk Road, bringing goods and stories from lands so distant they seemed like myths. The palace complex itself was a city within the city, surrounded by vermilion walls, entered through gates, each with their own name and symbolism. Inside, buildings with golden-tiled roofs rose above gardens, where ancient pines stood twisted by centuries of wind, where artificial mountains had been built to represent the sacred peaks of Chinese cosmology, where ponds reflected the sky like pieces of heaven brought to earth. The young woman from Shangxi passed through these gates, leaving behind everything familiar, entering a world governed by rules and hierarchies so complex that scholars spent lifetimes mastering them. The palace was organized around the emperor, who was understood not just as a political leader, but as the son of heaven, the intermediary between heaven and earth, the axis around which the cosmos turned. Everything in the palace, its architecture, its rituals, its daily routines, reflected and reinforced this cosmic order. As a Chiron, Wu Zhao's position was relatively modest. She was one of many young women in the palace, ranked below the empress, the imperial consorts, and several other levels of concubines. Her duties would have included attending to the emperor when summoned, participating in palace ceremonies, perhaps developing accomplishments in music, poetry, or calligraphy that might catch the emperor's attention. The life of a palace woman was one of exquisite confinement. The buildings where they lived were beautiful beyond description. Painted beams supporting upturned eaves, latticed windows through which light fell in geometric patterns, floors of polished stone, gardens visible through every opening. But they were also a prison of sorts, for the women could not leave without permission, could not see their families except on rare occasions, could not control their own destinies in any meaningful way. Emperor Taizong, the man at the center of this elaborate world, was one of the great rulers in Chinese history. He had helped his father establish the Tang Dynasty, had proven himself a brilliant military commander, and had become an emperor who combined strength with learning, who consulted with scholars and ministers, who sought to embody the Confucian ideal of the sage king. He was in his 30s when Wu Zhao entered the palace, at the height of his power and prestige. Whether the young concubine caught the emperor's eye in those early years, we cannot know with certainty. The palace contained hundreds of women, and the emperor's attention was a scarce resource competed for by many. What we do know is that Wu Zhao spent these years observing, learning, understanding the hidden mechanisms by which power flowed through the palace, not just the formal hierarchy of ranks and titles, but the informal networks of loyalty and obligation, the way information was currency, the way favors granted, created debts that could be called in later. Picture her in those early years, a young woman moving through marble corridors, her silk robes whispering against polished floors, her eyes taking in everything, her mind cataloguing and analyzing. She learned the palace's geography, not just its physical layout, but its emotional and political landscape. She learned who held real power versus who held only titles. She learned which eunuchs controlled access to the emperor, which ministers had his trust, which court ladies influenced decisions through whispered words in private moments. She also continued her education, for the palace was filled with scholars and artists, and an ambitious young woman could learn much by listening carefully. The great poets of the early Tang sometimes visited the court. Scholars debated philosophy and history in the gardens. Buddhist monks and Taoist priests came to perform ceremonies and discuss spiritual matters with the emperor, who was interested in religious questions and sought to balance the competing claims of Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism in his governance. The palace operated according to calendars both secular and sacred. There were the regular administrative meetings where the emperor met with his ministers to discuss matters of state. There were the seasonal festivals, the New Year celebrations with their fireworks and feasts, the Qingming festival for honoring ancestors, the Mid-Autumn festival for appreciating the moon. There were Buddhist ceremonies and Taoist rituals, each performed with elaborate attention to proper form and symbolism. Into this world of ritual and beauty, hierarchy and learning, the young Wu Zhao settled, patient as a seed, waiting for spring, observant as a scholar studying a text. The years passed in the slow, measured way they do when one is young and constrained, when life seems to be something that happens to you, rather than something you control. But beneath the surface, calm, beneath the obedience and the proper behavior, something was forming. Ambition, certainly, but also capability, the steady accumulation of knowledge and connections that would one day be turned to purposes no one yet imagined. The bells that marked the hours in the palace sounded the same for everyone, but some heard in them different meanings. For most of the palace women, the bells simply measured time passing, days folding into weeks, seasons turning in their eternal round. But for Wu Zhao, perhaps, they were measuring something else, the slow gathering of resources, of understanding, of readiness. She could not have known then what the future held, but she was preparing for it nonetheless, like a general positioning forces before a battle that has not yet been declared. Let yourself drift now in the silk-hung chambers of that ancient palace, where incense rises in thin streams through shafts of golden light, where the only sounds are the whisper of fabric and the distant chime of bells. This is where the story truly begins, in patience and observation, in the quiet gathering of strength, in a place where most women found only limitation. The young concubine from Shangxi had entered a world that seemed to leave her no room to grow, no space to rise. But limitation sometimes teaches resourcefulness, and patience sometimes is simply ambition choosing its moment. The palace of Emperor Taizong existed in a state of perpetual twilight elegance, where each moment was choreographed, each interaction laden with meanings that needed to be decoded. For Wu Zhao, now in her mid-teens and early 20s, these years in the palace were an education more comprehensive than any scholar's curriculum. She was learning the language of power, not the official pronouncements made in throne rooms, but the whispers in corridors, the carefully crafted letters, the strategic silences. In the intricate hierarchy of the palace, Wu Zhao's rank as Kairen placed her in a position that was both visible and invisible. She was close enough to the center to observe important people and events, but not so elevated that every move she made was scrutinized by rivals and enemies. This intermediate position, which some might have found frustrating, Wu Zhao turned to her advantage. She watched, she listened, she learned. The inner palace was predominantly a women's world, and like all societies within societies, it developed its own culture, its own dynamics of alliance and rivalry, friendship and enmity. The empress and higher-ranking consorts competed for the emperor's favor, and, through him, for influence over appointments and policies that affected their families. Lower-ranking women sought to rise through the hierarchy by bearing sons or by cultivating accomplishments that might distinguish them. But Wu Zhao seemed to understand, perhaps instinctively, that this conventional competition was a trap. The women who focused entirely on winning the emperor's romantic attention made themselves dependent on something they could not control, the emperor's desires, which were as changeable as spring weather. And even those who succeeded in this competition found that favor could disappear as quickly as it came, leaving them with nothing but memories and the bitter taste of displacement. Instead, Wu Zhao focused on making herself useful. She had been taught to read and write, unusual accomplishments for a woman of her time, and she used these skills to help with palace administration. There were always documents that needed to be copied, letters that needed to be drafted, records that needed to be maintained. By making herself helpful in these ways, she gained access to information and became someone that officials and eunuchs found valuable to have around. The eunuchs, those men who had been castrated to serve in the inner palace without posing any threat to the emperor's exclusive sexual access to his women, were crucial players in palace politics. They controlled access to the emperor, managed vast networks of servants and officials, and often accumulated significant wealth and influence. Many palace women dismissed or mistreated the eunuchs, seeing them as inferior. Wu Zhao, more perceptive, treated them with courtesy and cultivated relationships with those who seemed most capable and ambitious. Picture her in a quiet corner of the palace library, brushes and ink arranged before her, copying out an imperial edict or a piece of classical poetry. The light falls through latticed windows, creating patterns on the paper. Her hand moves with practiced grace, each character formed with careful attention to proportion and flow. A eunuch enters, bringing a new document that needs attention. She greets him with a slight smile, asks about his health, remembers the name of his hometown. These small courtesies, repeated over time, build relationships that will one day be worth more than gold. She also spent time in the company of older, more experienced palace women, learning from their stories and observations. The palace contained women who had been there for decades, who had served previous emperors, who had watched countless young beauties arrive full of hope and ambition, only to fade into obscurity when their youth departed. These older women, often ignored by those still caught up in the competition for favor, possessed deep knowledge of how the palace truly worked. Wu Zhao sought them out, listened to their stories, absorbed their wisdom. From them she learned that power in the palace came not from beauty alone, which faded, nor from the emperor's favor alone, which was fickle, but from three things: information, connections, and indispensability. Know what others do not know. Have relationships with the people who make things happen. Make yourself necessary to those who hold power. These three principles would guide her rise. But we must also acknowledge that Wu Zhao was moving through a world that offered women very few paths to power and agency. The Confucian philosophy that governed Tang society taught that women should be obedient to their fathers in youth, their husbands in marriage, and their sons in old age. The three obediences that defined proper feminine behavior. Women were not supposed to participate in government, to hold office, to compete with men in the public sphere. Their proper realm was the domestic, the private, the supportive. Yet history is filled with examples of women who found ways to exercise power despite these limitations, who worked within the system while also subverting it, who used the very expectations placed on them as tools for achieving what they wanted. Wu Zhao was becoming one of these women, though no one yet recognized it. Emperor Taizong himself seems to have noticed Wu Zhao's unusual qualities, though not in the way she might have hoped. There are accounts, possibly legendary but possibly true, that he recognized her intelligence and gave her the nickname Mei, meaning beautiful, but also capable. He apparently appreciated her literacy and occasionally employed her to help with documents. But he doesn't seem to have formed a deep romantic attachment to her, and she bore him no children during his reign. Both facts that, at the time, must have seemed like limitations, but would later prove to be advantages. The palace days followed their eternal rhythm. The morning audiences where the emperor met with ministers, the afternoon hours of leisure and study, the evening banquets and entertainments, the night hours when the emperor might summon one of his women or retire alone. The seasons turned, each bringing its festivals and observances. Spring brought the celebration of new growth, summer the long, warm evenings in the garden, autumn the harvest festivals, winter the quiet time of rest and reflection. Through all these cycles, Wu Zhao was aging from a teenager into a woman in her 20s. These were years that might have been wasted in idleness and boredom, in the slow despair that came from realizing that the dreams of youth would not be fulfilled. But she did not waste them. Every day she was adding to her store of knowledge and connections, building relationships, making herself valuable, positioning herself for opportunities she could not yet see, but sensed were coming. The palace was also a place of beauty that could inspire the spirit even as it constrained the body. The gardens were designed with exquisite attention to aesthetic principles, the arrangement of rocks to suggest mountains, the placement of paths to reveal new vistas with each turn, the selection of plants to provide interest in every season. Plum blossoms in late winter, peonies in spring, lotus in summer, chrysanthemums in autumn, each flower carrying layers of symbolic meaning that educated people could read like poetry. Wu Zhao, walking through these gardens in her rare moments of leisure, might have contemplated the symbolic resonance of her surroundings. The bamboo that bent in the wind but did not break, teaching flexibility. The pine that stayed green through winter, teaching endurance. The lotus that rose from muddy water to bloom in pure beauty, teaching that one's origins need not determine one's ultimate nature. These were not just pleasant natural images, but lessons in philosophy, reminders of virtues to be cultivated. The palace was also a center of artistic and cultural production. Poets came to court seeking patronage. Painters created scroll paintings of mountains and rivers, bamboo and plum blossoms, scenes from history and mythology. Calligraphers demonstrated their skill, turning writing into art, each character a small composition balancing proportion and flow. Musicians performed on the guqin and pipa, creating melodies that echoed the emotions of the heart and the movements of the cosmos. Wu Zhao, with her education and her intelligence, could appreciate all of this, could participate in the cultural life of the palace at a level deeper than mere observation. She could write poetry in the classical forms, compose verses that worked on multiple levels, demonstrating both technical skill and genuine feeling. She could appreciate the subtleties of a painting, the way a few brush strokes could suggest an entire mountain range, the way empty space was as important as the painted elements. These accomplishments did not directly translate to political power, but they gave her credibility with the educated officials who staffed the government, made her someone who could not be dismissed as merely a pretty face. As Emperor Taizong grew older, his health began to fail. He had been a vigorous man, a warrior in his youth who continued to hunt and practice martial arts well into middle age, but the years accumulated their weight, and illnesses began to weaken him. The palace, always alert to shifts in power, began to orient itself toward the future, toward the crown prince who would one day become emperor. The crown prince was Li Zhi, later to reign as Emperor Gaozong. He was younger than Taizong, naturally, and by all accounts a man of gentler disposition than his father, more interested in poetry and Buddhism than in military campaigns, more inclined to listen to advisers than to impose his own will, more concerned with harmony than with dominance. He visited his father regularly during the emperor's declining years, and during these visits he sometimes encountered Wu Zhao. What passed between them in those encounters we cannot know with certainty. The sources are contradictory, some claiming a deep connection formed immediately, others suggesting nothing. Noteworthy happened until later. But it seems likely that Wu Zhao made an impression on the crown prince, that her intelligence and presence distinguished her in his memory from the many other palace women he must have encountered. When Emperor Taizong died in 649, the established customs regarding imperial concubines were clear. Those who had borne the emperor sons would typically remain in the palace, their status protected by their children. Those who had not borne children, however, faced a different fate. They were expected to shave their heads, take Buddhist vows, and retire to convents where they would live out their days in religious seclusion, praying for the soul of the deceased emperor. For Wu Zhao, now about 25 years old, this must have seemed like the end of all possibilities, the closing of doors that had never fully opened. After more than a decade in the palace, after all her careful cultivation of skills and relationships, After all her patience and observation, she was to be sent away to live out her life in obscurity. The convent would provide for her material needs, but it would separate her from everything she had worked toward, everything she had learned. The silk robes would be exchanged for rough monastic garments, the palace gardens for a temple courtyard, the whispers of political intrigue for the chanting of sutras. Let yourself imagine that moment of transition, handled gently as befits this quiet hour. The cutting of hair, that symbol of beauty and femininity, the donning of plain robes, the procession from the palace, leaving behind the only adult world she had known. The gates of the convent closing behind her, seeming to close off the future itself. How many women had experienced this same transition, accepting it as fate, settling into a life of religious observance and quiet resignation? But Wu Zhao was not most women. The intelligence that had marked her since childhood, the ambition that had driven her to learn and observe and position herself, the understanding of power that she had developed through years of careful study, none of this could be extinguished by a nun's robes and a convent's walls. She had been forced to the margins before, as a child after her father's death. She had survived that and found her way back toward the center. She would do so again. In the convent, she continued what she had always done. She watched, she learned, she waited. She fulfilled her religious duties, chanted the sutras, meditated as required. But she also maintained connections with the world outside, kept herself informed of events at court, and especially of the new emperor, Li Ji, who had now become Emperor Gaozong. And perhaps in the quiet of the convent, she allowed herself to hope that the doors that had closed might yet open again, that the story was not over, but simply entering a new chapter, that patience and preparation would once again create opportunity where none seemed to exist. The temple bells rang out the hours, marking time in that eternal way they have, the sound carrying across the city, echoing off tile roofs and stone walls. To most who heard them, they were simply marking time's passage. But for Wu Zhao, perhaps, they were counting down toward something, measuring out the days until circumstances would shift again, until the careful work of building relationships and demonstrating capability would be rewarded, until the silken court would call her back from exile and give her a second chance to rise. The convent where Wu Zhao spent her years of religious seclusion wasn't a place of complete isolation. Buddhist monasteries and convents in Tang, China, maintained connections with the outside world. Pilgrims visited, officials came to sponsor ceremonies, messages passed in and out, carrying news of the wider world. For someone as intelligent and purposeful as Wu Zhao, even the walls of a convent could not completely sever the threads of connection she had spent years weaving. Emperor Gaozong, the young man who had succeeded his father, Taizong, was finding the weight of the dragon throne heavier than perhaps he had anticipated. He was a ruler of genuine learning and piety, drawn to Buddhism and its teachings of compassion. But he lacked his father's decisive strength. He relied heavily on advisors, particularly the powerful ministers who had served his father and who now guided the young emperor through the complexities of governance. His empress, Lady Wang, came from an old aristocratic family and had been chosen for her impeccable pedigree and proper upbringing. But the Empress had not borne the Emperor a son, and this was becoming a source of tension. In the imperial succession, sons were essential. They were the future of the dynasty, the guarantee of stability and continuity. Without an heir, the empire itself seemed uncertain, and factions at court began positioning themselves for possible succession crises. There was another woman at court who had borne Gaozong a son, Consort Xiao, who had been elevated to high rank and who, with a son to her credit, seemed positioned to displace Empress Wang in the emperor's affections, if not in formal title. The rivalry between Empress Wang and Consort Xiao was the kind of competition Wu Zhao had observed for years in Taizong's palace. Two women struggling for the emperor's favor, using all the tools available to palace women, trapped in a dynamic that made them enemies when they might have been allies. But the emperor was not content with his current situation. Reports suggest he had not forgotten Wu Zhao, that woman of unusual intelligence and presence he had encountered during his visits to his father. Whether it was genuine affection, simple loneliness, or a desire for someone who understood the burden of power, Gaozong began to think about bringing Wu Zhao back to the palace. This was not a simple matter. The established customs were clear. A deceased emperor's concubine who had taken religious vows should remain in the convent. To bring her back would be to violate propriety, to show disrespect for the late emperor, to set a precedent that might trouble the conservative officials who valued tradition above all else. But emperors have ways of accomplishing what they desire, and Gaozong found one. Empress Wang, calculating in her rivalry with Consort Xiao, apparently saw an opportunity. If Gaozong brought Wu Zhao back to the palace, the former concubine might draw the emperor's attention away from Consort Xiao, weakening her rival's position. Empress Wang had no son, but Wu Zhao had no son either. They would be on equal footing in that regard. And the empress, secure in her position as the primary wife, might have believed she could control or manipulate the returned concubine to serve her own purposes. So, Empress Wang supported Gaozong's desire to recall Wu Zhao from the convent. She even provided the pretext. Wu Zhao could be brought back to the palace to participate in a Buddhist ceremony. And then, well, one thing would lead to another. The conservative ministers grumbled, some more openly than others, but the emperor's desire combined with the empress's support was sufficient to overcome objections. In 650, just a year after entering the convent, Wu Zhao returned to the palace. She was about 26 years old, and this second entry into the imperial palace was fundamentally different from her first arrival as a teenage girl 13 years earlier. Then she had been one among many, a minor concubine with no particular status or prospects. Now she returned as someone the emperor specifically wanted, someone who had already demonstrated unusual capability, someone who had survived one expulsion from the palace and returned stronger. Imagine that return journey through Chang'an's wide avenues, back toward the palace gates that had seemed to close forever. Wu Zhao had spent years developing her understanding of power and cultivating relationships. She had been forced to the margins and had used that time to maintain her connections and deepen her knowledge. Now she was being given a second chance, and she would not waste it. In the palace, she was initially given the rank of Zhaoyi, a second-tier concubine rank, which was significantly higher than her previous position. This elevation announced that she was in favor, that the emperor valued her. But it also made her visible in new ways, subject to scrutiny from all the factions and players in palace politics. Empress Wang and consort Xiao both watched her carefully, each trying to determine whether this returned concubine would be ally, rival, or pawn. Wu Zhao understood that her position was precarious. She had the emperor's favor, but favor could be lost. She had status, but status could be stripped away. What she needed was power of a more durable kind. The power that came from being indispensable, from controlling information and access, from building alliances that would survive shifts in the emperor's attention. She cultivated a relationship with Gaozong that went beyond the merely romantic. She made herself useful to him in ways that other consorts, and even the Empress, didn't. She helped with documents and correspondence, offering opinions on matters of state when asked and sometimes when not asked. Her education, that unusual gift her father had given her, now proved its worth. She could read the complex documents that crossed the emperor's desk, could understand the philosophical and historical references in ministers' memorials, could offer insights that demonstrated real understanding. Gaozong, who was not the strongest of emperors and who relied heavily on advisors, seems to have appreciated having someone intelligent and knowledgeable close at hand, someone who had no official position in government, and therefore no obvious agenda beyond supporting him. Wu Zhao was careful to present her advice as mere suggestions, as observations from someone who wished only to serve the emperor's interests. She deferred to him publicly, reinforced his authority, made him feel wise and capable, even as she was quietly shaping his decisions. In 652, Wu Zhao bore Gaozong a son. This was a crucial development, for it gave her what Empress Wang lacked, a male heir who might one day succeed to the throne. The birth of a son transformed her status from that of a favored concubine to that of a potential future empress, dowager, the mother of an emperor, one of the most powerful positions a woman could hold in the Chinese imperial system. Empress Wang must have realized too late that she had made a terrible miscalculation. She had supported Wu Zhao's return, thinking to use her as a counter to consort Xiao. But Wu Zhao was not content to be anyone's pawn, and now, with a son, she was positioned to surpass both her rivals. The dynamics of palace politics were shifting, and Wu Zhao was no longer reacting to others' moves, but making moves of her own. What happened next is shrouded in controversy and legend. The sources tell a story that has been debated for centuries, involving the death of Wu Zhao's infant daughter under circumstances that she allegedly used to implicate Empress Wang. The historical evidence for this event is questionable, possibly fabricated by later historians who wanted to paint Wu Zhao as a monster. We need not dwell on such darkness in this peaceful hour, especially when the truth is uncertain. What is clear is that through a combination of intelligence, political skill, and ruthlessness when necessary, Wu Zhao systematically undermined both Empress Wang and consort Xiao. She used her influence with the emperor to isolate them, cutting off their access to him, turning him against them through suggestions and insinuations. She built alliances with certain officials and eunuchs who saw her as a rising power worth supporting. She demonstrated her capability in ways that made her seem like a better partner for the emperor than either of her rivals. The process took time, several years of careful maneuvering, but by 655, Gaozong was persuaded to take an action that was unprecedented in recent history. He deposed Empress Wang and installed Wu Zhao as the new empress. This required overcoming significant opposition from conservative ministers who saw such a move as improper on multiple levels. Wu Zhao had been his father's concubine. She came from a non-aristocratic family. She had shown herself to be too ambitious and capable for proper feminine subordination. But Gaozong, supported by a faction of officials who saw Wu Zhao as someone who could strengthen the emperor's position against the old aristocratic families, pushed through the change. Wu Zhao became Empress Wu, the first woman of non-aristocratic background to hold that position in the Tang Dynasty. She was 31 years old, and she had achieved what must have seemed impossible just a few years earlier when she was being sent to a convent. Picture the investiture ceremony, handled with all the elaborate ritual that the Tang court applied to such moments. The new empress, dressed in the formal regalia of her position, the phoenix crown upon her head, the elaborate robes embroidered with symbols of her status. The officials lined up in precise hierarchical order, performing the kowtows that acknowledged her position. The emperor beside her, his own authority reinforced by having a capable and intelligent partner. The incense rising through shafts of light, the bells and drums marking the moment, the chanted prayers blessing the arrangement. But ceremonies, for all their beauty and symbolic power, are just beginnings. Wu Zhao now held the title of empress, but she still needed to consolidate that power, to transform formal status into real influence, to ensure that what had been given could not be easily taken away. She had spent years studying how power worked, and now she would apply those lessons. She began participating directly in governance, attending morning audiences where the emperor met with ministers, offering opinions on appointments and policies. This was unusual. Empresses typically remained in the inner palace, managing household affairs and performing ceremonial roles, but not involving themselves in state business. Wu Zhao was different, and Gaozong seems to have welcomed her involvement, perhaps finding her intelligence and support helpful in dealing with the complex issues that came before the throne. Together, they were sometimes called the Two Sages, a recognition that Wu Zhao was not simply a ceremonial consort, but an active participant in governance. The ministers were divided in their response to this situation. Some appreciated her intelligence and her ability to help the emperor make decisions. Others were troubled by her involvement, seeing it as a violation of proper order, a woman stepping outside her ordained role. Wu Zhao also worked to reshape the power structure at court, replacing officials who had opposed her rise with those who supported her. She built connections with the emerging examination system that selected officials based on merit rather than family background, seeing it as a counterweight to the old aristocratic families who had opposed her elevation. She cultivated support among Buddhist institutions, which were happy to support an empress who was a generous patron of temples and monasteries. The years following her elevation to empress saw Wu Zhao steadily expanding her influence. When Gaozong suffered from illnesses that sometimes incapacitated him, Wu Zhao took on even more governmental responsibilities, issuing edicts in both their names, meeting with officials, making decisions that were implemented as imperial policy. The line between the emperor's will and the empress's will became increasingly blurred, and no one was quite sure anymore where one ended and the other began. This was power of a different order than the palace intrigues of concubines competing for favor. This was institutional power, the ability to shape policy and make appointments, to command armies and allocate resources, to determine the direction of an empire. Wu Zhao was accumulating this power gradually, carefully, making each step seem like a natural response to circumstances rather than a bold grab for authority. By the early 660s, less than a decade after becoming empress, Wu Zhao was effectively co-ruler of the Tang Empire with her husband. The conservative officials who had opposed her elevation watched with growing alarm as she extended her influence into every aspect of governance. But opposing her directly was dangerous. She had the emperor's support. She had built her own network of loyal officials and eunuchs, and she had demonstrated repeatedly that she knew how to outmaneuver her opponents. The palace gardens where she walked, the halls through which she moved, the throne room where she sat beside the emperor, all of these spaces had witnessed countless other rulers and consorts, had seen dynasties rise and fall, had absorbed the stories of power won and lost. But they had never before seen anything quite like Wu Zhao. This woman who had entered the palace as a minor concubine, been expelled to a convent, returned to become empress, and was now shaping the governance of the greatest empire on earth. Let yourself rest now in those garden pavilions, where the light falls gentle through bamboo screens, where the sound of water trickling over stones mingles with distant music. Wu Zhao had climbed from the margins to the center, had transformed limitation into opportunity, had made herself not just visible, but essential. The ambitious girl who studied her father's books, who survived rejection and exile, who watched and learned and waited. She was becoming something unprecedented in Chinese history, though the full extent of that transformation was yet to come. The moon rises over Chang'an, silver light washing over tile roofs and palace walls, the same moon that has witnessed all of human history, indifferent and eternal. Beneath that ancient light, the Dragon Empress was preparing for the next phase of her remarkable journey, gathering strength for what even she might not yet have fully imagined. The phoenix in Chinese mythology is a bird that lives for 1,000 years before being consumed by flames, only to be reborn from its own ashes, more glorious than before. This image of death and rebirth, of transformation through fire, resonates with Wu Zetian's journey from empress consort to emperor in her own right. A transformation that would take decades to complete and would require her to navigate crises and opportunities with equal skill. Throughout the 660s and 670s, Wu Zhao, now Empress Wu, steadily consolidated her power. When Emperor Gaozong suffered from debilitating illnesses, including severe headaches and eye problems that sometimes rendered him unable to fulfill his duties, Wu Zhao stepped into the breach. She issued edicts jointly with the emperor, managed the daily business of governance, met with ministers and foreign envoys. This arrangement, born of necessity, became normalized over time, until it seemed natural that the Empress should be deeply involved in ruling the empire. The palace from which she governed was a marvel of human creation, a physical manifestation of cosmic order as the Chinese understood it. The buildings were arranged according to principles of feng shui and sacred geometry, aligned with cardinal directions, their colors and decorations all carrying symbolic meaning. The yellow tiles of certain roofs proclaimed imperial status. The dragons coiling around pillars represented the emperor's power. The arrangement of courtyards and gates reflected the hierarchies of heaven and earth. In this setting, Wu Zhao held audiences, received reports, made decisions that affected millions of people across an empire that stretched from the deserts of Central Asia to the rice paddies of the south, from the mountains of the west to the coastal plains of the east. The Tang Empire at this point was at its zenith, cosmopolitan and wealthy, its capital Chang'an home to merchants from Persia and India, Sogdiana and Korea, each bringing goods and ideas that enriched the already sophisticated Chinese culture. Wu Zhao understood that power required legitimacy, that naked force alone could not sustain rule over time. She needed to be seen not as a usurper or an anomaly, but as someone whose authority was sanctioned by heaven itself, by the mandate that granted legitimacy to rulers. This was particularly challenging for a woman in a culture that had no tradition of female emperors, where all the precedents and all the philosophical justifications for rule assumed male leadership. She found her answer in Buddhism, that faith that had come to China centuries earlier from India and had been adapted and transformed in the process. Buddhism, unlike Confucianism, with its rigid gender hierarchies, offered more flexible models. There were female bodhisattvas, enlightened beings who helped others achieve salvation. There were Buddhist texts that spoke of the possibility of female Buddhahood. And there were Buddhist sutras that prophesied the coming of a great female ruler who would bring peace and prosperity to the world. Wu Zhao became a generous patron of Buddhist temples and monasteries. She sponsored the creation of great statues, including the famous Longmen grottos, where a massive Buddha was carved from a cliff face, its face allegedly modeled on her own. She had Buddhist texts translated and disseminated, particularly those that supported the idea of righteous female rule. She surrounded herself with Buddhist advisors who provided her with scriptural justification for her growing authority. When Emperor Gaozong died in 683, after decades of Wu Zhao's increasing dominance, the question of succession became immediate and critical. By Confucian tradition, the throne should pass to the emperor's son, and indeed it did. First to Li Jie, who became Emperor Zhongzong, and then, when he proved too independent, to his younger brother Li Dan, who became Emperor Ruizong. But both of these young emperors were understood by everyone, themselves included, to be essentially regents keeping the throne warm for their mother. Wu Zhao, now properly called Empress Dowager Wu, was the real power. She held court from behind a silk screen, the young emperor sitting visibly on the throne, while his mother, invisible behind the screen, actually made the decisions. This arrangement preserved the fiction that a man was emperor while acknowledging the reality that Wu Zetian ruled. It was an intermediate step, a way station on the journey from Empress consort to Emperor proper. But Wu Zetian was not content with power exercised from behind screens. She wanted what she had effectively possessed for years to be formally recognized. She wanted to be emperor in name as well as in fact, to sit openly on the dragon throne, to receive the kowtows and the tributes that acknowledged supreme authority. This desire, understandable as it was, ran counter to every tradition and custom of Chinese governance. The campaign to make this transformation required years of careful preparation. Wu Zetian needed to build popular support, to overcome official opposition, to create an ideological framework that would make the unprecedented seem inevitable. She used every tool available: propaganda, intimidation, rewards for supporters, and punishment for opponents, appeals to religion and prophecy, demonstrations of her administrative competence. She revised and promoted Buddhist texts, particularly the Great Cloud Sutra, which prophesied the reincarnation of Maitreya Buddha as a female monarch who would rule over a world of peace and prosperity. Scholars and monks identified Wu Zetian as this prophesied ruler, providing cosmic justification for her earthly ambitions. Temples throughout the empire promoted this interpretation, and millions of people heard sermons explaining that their Empress Dowager wasn't merely a skilled administrator, but a being of spiritual significance. She also worked to demonstrate that she could govern well, that her rule brought prosperity and stability. Under her guidance, the Tang Empire remained powerful and well administered. The examination system for selecting officials was expanded, bringing talented men from non-aristocratic backgrounds into government. Agricultural production was encouraged through sensible policies. The borders were defended against threats. Trade flourished along the Silk Road, bringing wealth into imperial coffers. Finally, in the year 690, Wu Zetian took the ultimate step. She declared the Tang Dynasty at an end and proclaimed a new dynasty, the Zhou, with herself as its emperor. Not empress, but emperor, using the male title that signified supreme authority. She was 65 years old, an age when most people were contemplating retirement, not ascending to formal supreme power. But she had spent decades preparing for this moment, building the necessary foundation, creating the conditions that made it possible. The ceremony in which she ascended the throne was magnificent, combining traditional Chinese imperial ritual with Buddhist elements that reflected her religious patronage. She wore the imperial dragon robes, sat upon the dragon throne, received the obeisance of her officials, issued edicts under the mandate of heaven. She took the title Holy and Divine Emperor, claiming status that combined political and spiritual authority. This was unprecedented in Chinese history. A woman ruling as emperor in her own right, not as regent for a son or grandson, not hidden behind screens, but openly and formally claiming the supreme position. The conservative Confucian officials were appalled, but many had been purged or intimidated into silence. Others, particularly those who had risen through the examination system and owed their positions to Wu Zetian's patronage, supported her. The Buddhist establishment celebrated her enthronement as the fulfillment of prophecy. Let yourself imagine that moment, handled with the grandeur and solemnity it deserves. The great throne hall, its columns painted crimson and gold, its ceiling soaring overhead, decorated with dragons and phoenixes. The assembled officials in their ranked positions, their silk robes creating a sea of color. The incense rising in great bronze burners, its smoke carrying prayers toward heaven. The bells and drums announcing the moment. And at the center, Wu Zetian, the woman who had been told her place was silent and subordinate, now seated on the dragon throne, clothed in imperial yellow, receiving the acknowledgement of the most powerful empire on earth. She ruled as emperor from 690 to 705, a period of 15 years, during which she was the undisputed supreme authority in China. Her reign saw continued prosperity and stability, innovative policies and administrative reforms. She promoted capable officials regardless of their family background, supporting the examination system as a meritocratic alternative to aristocratic privilege. She maintained the empire's military strength while generally preferring diplomatic solutions to conflicts. She was a patron of the arts and of Buddhist culture, sponsoring magnificent construction projects and the creation of beautiful art. But power at such heights is never entirely secure, and Wu Zetian faced challenges and opposition throughout her reign. There were revolts by princes and officials who rejected her authority, though these were suppressed. There were grumblings from conservatives who saw her rule as an abomination against natural order. There were the inevitable tensions and jealousies that surround any seat of power, the factions and conspiracies that form like eddies in a stream. Wu Zetian dealt with these challenges through a combination of competence, strategic clemency, and, when necessary, ruthlessness. She rewarded loyalty generously and punished betrayal severely. She maintained an extensive intelligence network that kept her informed of potential threats. She knew that her position, however formally legitimized, remained vulnerable because it was unprecedented, and she could not afford to appear weak. She also made controversial use of harsh officials who investigated and punished real or suspected treason. This period saw accusations of conspiracy and charges of plotting against the throne, with officials and nobles being arrested, tried, and sometimes executed. The extent to which these threats were real versus manufactured for political purposes is debated by historians, but the atmosphere at court became one where caution was paramount and loyalty had to be demonstrated constantly. Yet despite these darker aspects of her rule, Wu Zetian's reign was not remembered primarily for terror, but for competence and prosperity. The empire was well governed, the people generally secure and fed, the borders defended, the culture flourishing. She proved, whatever one might think of her methods, that a woman could wield supreme power effectively, could command armies and bureaucracies, could make the complex decisions required to govern a vast empire. The palace where she held court was not just a center of political power, but also a cultural beacon. Poets and scholars sought positions there, hoping to gain her patronage. Artists created works to honor her and the dynasty she had founded. Buddhist monks from across Asia came to Chang'an, drawn by her reputation as a defender of the faith. The city hummed with activity. Merchants in the West Market selling goods from distant lands, students studying for examinations that might lead to government positions, pilgrims visiting the great temples, artists and craftsmen producing works of extraordinary beauty. In the imperial gardens, carefully tended by armies of gardeners, the seasons turned with their eternal rhythm. Spring brought the blooming of fruit trees, their blossoms falling like snow in the slightest breeze. Summer brought lush growth, the gardens green and full, the sound of cicadas filling the warm air. Autumn brought chrysanthemums in every color, those flowers that symbolized longevity and endurance. Winter brought spare beauty, the bare branches of trees creating patterns against grey skies, the occasional snow transforming the landscape into an ink painting come to life. Through all these seasons, Wu Zetian governed, sitting in judgment, making decisions, shaping policy, managing the vast apparatus of empire. She had achieved what she had spent her life working toward: supreme power, formal recognition, the ability to shape the world according to her vision. The phoenix had been reborn from ashes, more glorious than before, transformed by will and intelligence and patient determination. As you drift deeper toward sleep, let the images soften. The great throne hall fading into golden haze, the sound of bells becoming distant and dreamlike, the figure of the Empress-Emperor becoming an icon rather than a person, a symbol of possibility and transformation. She had shown that the limits society placed on women were not natural or inevitable, but constructed and contingent, that exceptional individuals could transcend these limits through exceptional effort and ability. The dragons coiling around palace columns seemed to acknowledge a new kind of power, as ancient principles adapted to accommodate unprecedented reality. The reign of Wu Zetian as emperor unfolded during what historians consider one of the golden ages of Chinese civilization, when art and culture flourished like peonies in spring gardens, when poets composed verses that would be read and recited for centuries to come, when the very air of Chang'an seemed thick with creativity and refinement. Though she was often at the center of political storms, Wu Zetian's era also saw remarkable cultural achievements that had little to do with the controversies surrounding her rule and everything to do with the broader flourishing of Tang civilization. The Tang Dynasty, even under Wu Zetian's Zhou interregnum, represented a peak of Chinese culture. The empire was confident and cosmopolitan, open to influences from the Silk Road, while maintaining its distinctive character. In Chang'an, the capital where Wu Zetian held court, one could hear languages from across Asia, could see architectural styles borrowed from Persia and India, could taste foods flavored with spices from lands so distant they seemed mythical. The Silk Road, that great network of trade routes connecting China with the Mediterranean world, was at its height during this period. Caravans traveled from Chang'an westward through the deserts and mountains of Central Asia, carrying silk and porcelain, tea and paper, and returning with precious metals, gems, glassware, and exotic animals. The flow of goods was also a flow of ideas. Buddhism had come to China this way, and so had other religions and philosophies, artistic styles and technologies. Wu Zetian's court, despite her Buddhist preferences, remained a center where multiple traditions met and mingled. Confucian scholars still held positions in government, their knowledge of the classics essential for administration and diplomacy. Taoist priests performed ceremonies at important moments in the ritual calendar. Buddhist monks debated philosophy and translated sutras from Sanskrit. Nestorian Christians, Zoroastrians, and even some Muslims lived in Chang'an, practicing their faiths with the tolerance that characterized the cosmopolitan Tang. Poetry in this era reached heights it would perhaps never exceed again in Chinese literature. The Tang Dynasty is famous for its poetry, and some of the greatest poets in Chinese history lived during or near Wu Zetian's time. These poets wrote in forms that had been perfected over centuries, the regulated verse with its strict requirements for tonal pattern and rhyme, the freer ancient style verse that allowed more flexibility. Their poems captured everything from grand philosophical themes to intimate personal moments, from landscapes that suggested cosmic truths to drinking parties among friends. Picture a gathering of scholars and officials in one of the palace gardens on a moonlit evening. They have been drinking wine, sharing poems, demonstrating their learning and sensitivity. Someone composes a poem about the moon reflected in a cup of wine, using the image to meditate on the relationship between reality and reflection, appearance and essence. Another writes of parting from a friend who is leaving for a distant posting, the sorrow of separation mixed with wishes for safe journey. These poems are not mere entertainment, but demonstrations of cultural accomplishment, ways of participating in a tradition thousands of years old. Wu Zetian herself was literate and cultured, capable of composing poetry and appreciating the works of others. This was expected of emperors. They should be not just military leaders and administrators, but also patrons and participants in high culture. She commissioned works of art, sponsored poets and scholars, maintained the imperial library with its thousands of scrolls and books, supported the compilation of encyclopedias and historical records. The visual arts flourished as well. Painters created works on silk and paper, using brushes and ink to capture landscapes that were simultaneously realistic and symbolic, that showed the visible world while suggesting the invisible forces animating it. A painting of mountains and rivers was not just a depiction of a particular place, but a meditation on the relationship between humanity and nature, the small and the vast, the transient and the eternal. Calligraphy, the art of beautiful writing, was considered the highest of the visual arts because it required both technical skill and spiritual refinement. A master calligrapher's characters carried the essence of the writer's personality and cultivation, the ink flowing in ways that revealed character, the balance and proportion of each stroke demonstrating discipline and aesthetic understanding. Wu Zetian's own calligraphy was judged competent by contemporary standards, and she commissioned many inscriptions and steles that combined political messaging with aesthetic display. Buddhist art, in particular, flourished under Wu Zetian's patronage. The great cave temples at Longmen, begun before her reign, were expanded with new grottos and statues. The most famous is the Vairocana Buddha, a massive stone figure with a face supposedly modeled on Wu Zetian herself, seated in serene meditation, its eyes half closed in contemplation, its hand raised in a gesture of teaching and reassurance. This statue, and others like it, represented not just religious devotion, but also technological and artistic achievement. The ability to carve such figures from living rock required skill, organization, and resources that only a powerful state could muster. The ceramics of the Tang Dynasty are treasured to this day. The famous Sankai, or three-color glazed pottery, with its dripping patterns of green, amber, and trim. The elegant white porcelain that was beginning to be perfected. The practical but beautiful stoneware used in daily life. These objects were both utilitarian and artistic, demonstrating that beauty could be found in everyday items, that the distinction between art and craft was not absolute. Music filled the palace and the city, the melancholy notes of the pipa, a pear-shaped lute brought from Central Asia, the resonant tones of the guqin, the ancient Chinese zither associated with scholars and philosophers, the bright sound of flutes, and the deep boom of drums. Different occasions called for different music: ritual music for ceremonies, entertainment music for banquets, popular songs for markets and festivals. Wu Zetian maintained an imperial music bureau that employed hundreds of musicians and dancers, preserving ancient forms while also incorporating new styles from the Silk Road. Dance, too, was highly developed art form. The dancers at court performed pieces that told stories from mythology and history, their movements precisely choreographed, their costumes elaborate confections of silk and jewels. Some dances were graceful and slow, suggesting the movement of clouds or the swaying of willow branches. Others were vigorous and martial, representing battles or hunting scenes. Foreign dances from Central Asia and India were adapted and incorporated, their exotic movements adding variety to the courtly repertoire. The examination system, which Wu Zetian supported and expanded, created a class of scholar officials who were deeply versed in classical literature and philosophy. To pass the highest level of examinations required years of study, memorization of thousands of pages of classical texts, ability to compose poetry and essays, understanding of history and philosophy. Those who succeeded gained not just government positions, but also social prestige, becoming members of an elite that transcended mere wealth or family background. This emphasis on learning and culture had practical effects as well as aesthetic ones. An educated bureaucracy could administer the empire more effectively, could maintain records and implement policies, could serve as a counterbalance to military power. The examination system, though it had its limitations and was never fully meritocratic, did provide some opportunity for talented men from modest backgrounds to rise to positions of influence. Wu Zetian, herself someone who had risen from non-aristocratic origins, appreciated the way the examination system could weaken the old aristocracy's grip on power. The libraries and archives of the empire preserved not just literature, but also scientific and technical knowledge. Tang China was advanced in many fields: astronomy, medicine, agriculture, engineering, cartography. Astronomers maintained careful records of celestial events, believing that heavenly phenomena reflected or predicted earthly affairs. Physicians drew on both traditional Chinese medical theory and knowledge from Indian and Islamic sources. Engineers designed and built the canals and irrigation systems that supported agricultural productivity. Cartographers created maps that showed the empire's extent and its relationship to surrounding regions. Agricultural innovations during this period supported a growing population. Better understanding of irrigation, the development of new rice varieties, the expansion of cultivation into previously marginal lands. All of these contributed to the prosperity that underwrote the empire's military and cultural achievements. Wu Zetian's government, like the Tang generally, paid careful attention to agricultural policy, understanding that the empire's power rested ultimately on the productivity of its farmers. The cities of the Tang Empire, and Chang'an especially, were wonders of urban planning and architecture. Chang'an was laid out in a grid pattern, with wide avenues running north-south and east-west, dividing the city into wards. Each ward was enclosed by walls and gates that were closed at night, creating neighborhoods within the larger city. The scale was immense. At its height, Chang'an may have had 1 million inhabitants, making it the largest city in the world at that time. The markets of Chang'an offered goods from across the known world. In the West Market, merchants from Central Asia sold goods brought via the Silk Road: jade and precious stones, carpets and textiles, spices and medicinal herbs, exotic animals and rare birds. In the East Market, Chinese goods predominated: silk in every color and pattern, porcelain and lacquerware, books and paintings, tea and medicines. The government regulated these markets, maintaining standards for weights and measures, collecting taxes, preventing fraud. But perhaps the most distinctive feature of Wu Zetian's reign, culturally speaking, was the way she used cultural production for political purposes. She commissioned inscriptions and steles that promoted her vision of her rule as divinely sanctioned and beneficial. She sponsored the translation and dissemination of Buddhist texts that supported her authority. She had histories revised to present her family and her rise to power in favorable light. She created new characters in the written language, including a new character for her personal name that elevated it above ordinary usage. This intersection of culture and politics was not new. Chinese rulers had always used cultural forms to legitimize and strengthen their power. But Wu Zetian brought to it an intensity and sophistication that was remarkable. She understood that controlling how people thought about her reign required controlling not just policy, but also narrative, not just present actions, but also historical interpretation. The poetry written during her reign sometimes reflected these political concerns. There were verses praising her wisdom and virtue, celebrating the peace and prosperity of her rule, comparing her to sage rulers of antiquity or to the enlightened bodhisattvas of Buddhism. But there were also poems that had nothing to do with politics, verses about the beauty of nature, the sorrow of parting, the pleasures of wine and friendship, the passing of time. These poems remind us that even in a highly politicized environment, culture had spaces that escaped direct political control, where human experiences could be explored for their own sake. As you drift deeper toward sleep now, let yourself float through these scenes of cultural refinement, the brush moving across silk, creating characters that are both meaning and beauty. The notes of a guqin echoing in a moonlit garden, the great statues emerging from stone under the patient work of countless artisans, the caravans arriving from the west with their exotic goods and stories. This was Wu Zetian's China, powerful and prosperous, creating works of art that would survive long after her political innovations were forgotten, weaving patterns of beauty that would persist through dynasties and centuries. The incense rises in thin streams, the bells sound their evening call, and the lights of Chang'an begin to glow as darkness falls over the city, each lit window a small world of human activity and aspiration. In this vast tapestry of culture, Wu Zetian was one thread, important but not singular, her reign part of the larger story of Chinese civilization at one of its peaks. In the ancient philosophy that governed Chinese political thought, the emperor ruled not by mere force or hereditary right, but by the mandate of heaven, a concept that made sovereignty both absolute and conditional. Heaven granted the mandate to rulers who were virtuous and capable, who brought prosperity and order to their people. But heaven could also withdraw that mandate from rulers who became corrupt or tyrannical, manifesting its displeasure through natural disasters, popular rebellions, or the simple decline of the dynasty's power and prestige. For Wu Zetian, claiming this mandate was particularly challenging because it required overcoming deeply ingrained assumptions about gender and rule. The classical texts that all educated Chinese knew taught that heaven, earth, emperor, father, and husband were all yang, masculine, active, commanding principles. Women, by contrast, were yin, feminine, passive, receptive. The cosmic order itself seemed to suggest that men should rule and women should obey. How could a woman claim the mandate of heaven when the very categories seemed to exclude her? Wu Zetian's answer was to reinterpret and expand the tradition rather than simply rejecting it. She could not dismiss Confucianism entirely, as it was too deeply embedded in Chinese culture, and particularly in the bureaucracy she needed to govern. Instead, she supplemented it with Buddhism, a religious tradition more flexible in its thinking about gender, and with creative reinterpretations of a Chinese mythology and cosmology that allowed for female rule. The Great Cloud Sutra, which Wu Zetian promoted extensively, predicted the appearance of a female Maitreya Buddha who would rule as a universal monarch, bringing peace and prosperity to the world. Buddhist scholars and monks identified Wu Zetian as this prophesied ruler, providing religious sanction for what political tradition made difficult. Temples throughout the empire spread this teaching, and millions of people heard that their emperor wasn't merely a capable administrator, but a bodhisattva incarnate, a being of spiritual advancement who had chosen to take human form to help all sentient beings. This claim to spiritual status served multiple purposes. It justified Wu Zetian's rule in terms that transcended secular political objections. It elevated her above ordinary human limitations and criticisms. It created a narrative in which opposition to her was not merely political disagreement, but spiritual blindness, a failure to recognize the working of cosmic forces. And it connected her rule to the deep human longing for meaning and transcendence, making her reign part of a sacred story rather than merely a historical accident. Wu Zetian also patronized Buddhism extensively, demonstrating her devotion and strengthening the religious institutions that supported her. She sponsored the construction and renovation of temples, the creation of statues and religious art, the translation of sutras, the support of monastic communities. Buddhist monasteries became wealthy and powerful under her patronage, and in return they provided legitimacy and ideological support. But she did not abandon Confucianism entirely. She continued to use the examination system to select officials, maintained the imperial rituals that connected her rule to ancient precedents, presented herself as a student of the classics even as she challenged their gender assumptions. She performed the sacrifices to heaven and earth that emperors were expected to perform, wore the imperial robes embroidered with dragons and other symbols of cosmic authority, issued edicts using the traditional formulas that invoked heaven's mandate. She also created new symbolism and mythology around her rule. She associated herself with the phoenix, that mythical bird that in Chinese tradition represented the empress consort, but which she reimagined as a symbol of imperial power equal to, or perhaps superseding, the dragon. She commissioned works that emphasized female worthies from Chinese history, women who had been wise advisors to emperors, mothers who had raised sage rulers, even legendary female leaders from ancient times. By creating this genealogy of female power and virtue, she suggested that her rule was not unprecedented, but was actually a recovery of ancient patterns. The mandate of heaven concept included the idea that heaven communicated with humanity through omens and portents. Unusual natural phenomena, astronomical events, the appearance of auspicious animals, all of these were read as signs of heaven's pleasure or displeasure with the current ruler. Wu Zetian's government was attentive to this dimension, ensuring that positive omens were reported and publicized, while negative ones were explained away or suppressed. When natural disasters occurred, as they inevitably did, floods or droughts, earthquakes or crop failures, the government responded in ways designed to demonstrate the emperor's concern for the people and ability to manage crises. Relief supplies were distributed, taxes were remitted for affected areas, ceremonies were performed to appeal to heaven for mercy. These responses served both practical and symbolic functions, addressing the immediate crisis, while also showing that the emperor maintained the proper relationship with heaven. Wu Zetian also reformed certain aspects of ritual and law to reflect her position. She introduced new protocols for court ceremonies, created new titles and ranks, reformed the legal code to emphasize certain principles. These changes, while sometimes controversial, demonstrated that she held supreme authority, that her word could reshape the institutions that governed the empire. The question of succession was particularly fraught for Wu Zetian. As a woman who had claimed imperial authority, whom should she name as her heir? If she named one of her own sons, she would be acknowledging that male succession was proper and perhaps implicitly undermining her own claim. If she named someone from her natal Wu family, she would be rejecting the Li family of the Tang Dynasty, potentially creating opposition from those still loyal to the previous dynasty. This dilemma had no easy solution, and it created uncertainty that would ultimately contribute to the end of her reign. Throughout her rule, Wu Zetian walked a careful line between demonstrating strength and maintaining the ideological frameworks that made authority meaningful. She could not rule by force alone. No emperor could, not over a population of millions spread across vast distances. She needed people to believe in her right to rule, to see her authority as legitimate and proper rather than as mere usurpation. This required constant work of persuasion and presentation. The edicts issued in her name emphasized her care for the people, her wise governance, her success in maintaining peace and prosperity. The inscriptions on monuments celebrated her virtues and achievements. The histories being compiled under her direction presented her rise as inevitable and proper. The temples spread Buddhist teachings that made her rule religiously significant. But there was also genuine achievement underlying this propaganda. The empire during her reign was generally peaceful and prosperous. The examination system she supported did bring talented individuals into government. The legal reforms she implemented did address real problems and improve governance. The cultural flourishing of the era was not simply manufactured, but reflected real creativity and vitality. The mandate of heaven, in the pragmatic understanding that governed Chinese political thought, was partly demonstrated through results. A prosperous, stable, well-governed empire was evidence that heaven supported the ruler. In the quiet evenings, when official business was concluded and the palace began its slow transition toward night, Wu Zetian might have contemplated the great questions of rule and legitimacy that had occupied her for so long. Did she believe in the Buddhist teachings that proclaimed her a bodhisattva? Did she accept the mandate she claimed? Or was it simply a useful fiction? We cannot know her inner thoughts, but we can recognize that whatever her private beliefs, she had succeeded in creating a framework that made her unprecedented rule seem, to many of her subjects, legitimate and proper. Picture those evening moments, handled with the gentleness that suits this hour. The emperor in her private chambers, the day's formal robes exchanged for simpler garments, the weight of the crown set aside, the incense burning low, the lamps casting soft shadows on walls decorated with scrolls of calligraphy and paintings of mountains. Outside, the palace gardens are quiet, the fish in the ponds settled for the night, the pavilions empty. The city beyond the palace walls is also settling into evening rhythms, families gathering for meals, shops closing, the night watch beginning its rounds. In this quietness, the cosmic significance and political necessity that surrounded Wu Zetian's rule might seem distant or abstract. Here was simply a woman who had climbed to power through ability and determination, who was trying to govern well while managing the constant challenges and threats that came with supreme authority. The mandate of heaven, the Buddhist prophecies, the Confucian precedents, all of these were tools she used, frameworks she worked within and reshaped to serve her purposes. But beneath them was the simple human reality of someone trying to rule an empire, to make decisions that would affect millions, to secure a legacy that would last beyond her lifetime. As you drift toward deeper sleep, let the concepts soften and dissolve. The mandate, the prophecies, the elaborate justifications. What remains is the image of a person navigating extraordinary circumstances with intelligence and will, finding ways to make the impossible possible, creating new patterns while claiming ancient authority. The moon rises over Chang'an, its light impartial and eternal, shining equally on palace and cottage, on the powerful and the powerless, indifferent to claims of mandate or legitimacy, simply present in its ancient rhythm. As Wu Zetian entered her 70s and then 80s, the question of the future became increasingly pressing. She had ruled effectively for decades, first as Empress consort and regent, then as emperor in her own right. But even the most capable ruler cannot govern forever, and the question of succession, always present in any monarchy, became the central political issue of her later years. Wu Zetian faced a dilemma that was partly of her own making. She had created a new dynasty, the Zhou, displacing the Tang Dynasty founded by her husband's ancestors. But whom should succeed her? Her own sons were Li family members, carrying Tang bloodline. To name one of them as heir would be to acknowledge that the Tang should be restored, effectively admitting that her Zhou dynasty was merely an interregnum. Yet to name someone from her natal Wu family, creating a new line of succession, would create opposition from all those who remained loyal to the Li family and the Tang tradition. For years, she avoided making a clear decision, perhaps hoping that circumstances would resolve the dilemma, perhaps simply unable to face the implications of either choice. But as her health began to decline in the early years of the 8th century, when she was in her late 70s, the issue could no longer be postponed. Factions at court, always present but usually suppressed by her strong rule, began to position themselves for the succession struggle they saw coming. The palace, which had been the center of her power for so many years, became a place of whispered conspiracies and shifting alliances. The officials and ministers, many of whom had been appointed by Zetian and owed their positions to her, nonetheless had to think about the future after her. The military commanders, controlling the forces that could ultimately determine succession, weighed their options. The princes who might inherit, each with their supporters and their claims, waited for the moment when destiny would be decided. In 704, when Zetian was 80 years old, a group of officials, led by ministers who had served her faithfully, finally forced the issue. They argued that the empire needed clear succession, that her health was declining, that the Zhou dynasty she had created had served its purpose, but should now give way to restoration of the Tang under one of her sons. They presented her with a fait accompli, having secured enough support to make their position irresistible. On February 20th, 705, Zetian abdicated, yielding the throne to her son Li Xian, who resumed the imperial title as Emperor Zhongzong. The Zhou dynasty, which had lasted from 690 to 705, came to an end after just 15 years. The Tang Dynasty, interrupted but not destroyed, was restored. Zetian, no longer emperor, retired to a palace where she lived out her remaining months quietly, removed from the power she had wielded for so long. She died on December 16th, 705, at the age of 81. Her death came less than a year after her abdication, and one wonders whether the loss of power hastened her end, whether someone so long accustomed to supreme authority found life without it unbearable. But perhaps, in those final months, she found a different kind of peace. Release from the constant vigilance and strategic calculation that power demanded. Freedom from the burden of decision that never ceased. Space, finally, to rest. The question of how to remember her began immediately and continues to this day. Her supporters pointed to the prosperity and stability of her reign, the cultural flourishing that occurred during her time, the innovations in governance that outlasted her. Her critics emphasized the harshness of her punishments, the ways she had violated traditional norms and propriety, the suffering of those who had opposed her. Neither view was complete, but both contained truth. In a compromise that reflected the complexity of her legacy, her son decided that she should be buried alongside her husband, Gaozong, in the Qianling Mausoleum, a massive tomb complex built into a mountain northwest of Chang'an. This decision acknowledged her importance while also reintegrating her into the Tang family story, presenting her as Empress consort rather than as the separate emperor she had claimed to be. The tomb complex where she rests is magnificent, befitting the most powerful woman in Chinese history. A spirit path leads to the tomb, lined with stone statues, officials, generals, foreign envoys, animals both real and mythical. These figures, carved from stone, have stood guard for more than 13 centuries, weathering storms and political changes, witnessing the rise and fall of dynasties that came after the Tang. Most intriguing is the memorial stele that stands near the tomb, a massive stone slab that was erected to commemorate Wu Zetian's life and achievements. But the stele is blank, without inscription, though it was surely intended to carry text praising her. Why it remains blank is a mystery. Perhaps her son, having to navigate between those who revered his mother and those who despised her, found it impossible to compose text that would satisfy both camps. Perhaps the blankness was deliberate, a way of letting each generation write its own interpretation, rather than fixing one in stone. This blank stele has become a perfect metaphor for Wu Zetian's legacy, something monumental and undeniable, but whose meaning remains open to interpretation, where each era can see reflected its own concerns and values. For traditional Confucian historians, she was an example of what happened when proper order was violated, a warning about the dangers of women in power. For feminists and modernizers, she was a woman who refused to accept limitations, who demonstrated that women could govern as effectively as men. For pragmatists, she was a capable administrator whose methods were sometimes harsh, but who maintained prosperity and stability. All of these readings contains partial truths, and none exhausts her complexity. The decades following her death saw the Tang Dynasty restored, but also transformed. Some of her innovations were retained, others reversed. The examination system she had supported continued and expanded, eventually becoming the primary path to official position. The Buddhist institutions she had patronized remained powerful, though they would face persecution in later eras. The precedent she had set, that a woman could rule as emperor, was simultaneously acknowledged and rejected, remembered and suppressed. Chang'an continued as the capital, that great city that had been the stage for her rise and reign. But cities, like dynasties, have their seasons. The later Tang would face challenges and eventually decline. Chang'an would be attacked and destroyed more than once, its population scattered, its monuments damaged or lost. The Tang Dynasty itself would fall in 907, 2 centuries after Wu Zetian's death, giving way to the period of 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms before the Song Dynasty would restore unified rule. Through all these changes, Wu Zetian's memory persisted, controversial and compelling. Stories about her circulated, some true, some exaggerated, some invented. She appeared in historical records, in popular tales, in operas and novels. Each telling shaped her differently, emphasized different aspects of her life and rule, made her serve different narrative purposes. She became less a person than a symbol, capable of meaning many different things to different people. In the modern era, Wu Zetian has been rediscovered and reassessed. Archaeologists have excavated her tomb complex, though the main burial chamber remains sealed, its contents still a mystery. Historians have sifted through the sources, trying to separate fact from legend, trying to understand her in her own context, rather than through the distortions of later tradition. She has become a subject of popular culture, television dramas, novels, films, each offering its own interpretation. What can we say with confidence about her legacy? She was the only woman in Chinese history to rule as emperor in her own right, to claim openly the mandate of heaven and sit on the dragon throne. She governed effectively, maintaining prosperity and stability through her reign. She supported cultural and artistic achievement, patronized Buddhism, promoted the examination system. She was intelligent, capable, and ruthless when she deemed ruthlessness necessary. She challenged gender norms profoundly while also working within traditional frameworks to legitimize her power. But perhaps her most important legacy is simply the fact that she existed and ruled, that the thing people said was impossible, a woman emperor, happened, and the empire did not collapse, heaven did not withdraw its mandate, the cosmic order did not shatter. She proved that the limitations placed on women were social constructions rather than natural laws, that exceptional individuals could transcend and transform the categories that society used to constrain them. As twilight deepens over Chang'an, as the ancient city fades into the shadows of history, as the Tang Dynasty itself becomes memory and legend, Wu Zetian remains a figure who commands attention and invites reflection. She was not a person of simple virtue or simple vice, not a heroine or a villain, but something more complex and human. Someone who saw possibilities that others missed, who seized opportunities that others let pass, who refused to accept limits that others took as absolute, and who, through intelligence and will and remarkable persistence, carved out a place for herself at the summit of power in a world that insisted such a place could not exist. Let yourself rest now in that twilight, where distinctions soften and opposites meet, where the judgments we make in clear light become less certain, where history dissolves into story and story into dream. The Empress Emperor sleeps in her mountain tomb, her name carved on nothing and everything, her legacy written in blank stone, waiting for each generation to write its own interpretation. The stars wheel overhead, the same stars that shone on her rise and fall, indifferent witnesses to human striving and achievement, marking time in their eternal rounds.